Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for attending week 4 of BFSG's 4-part summer webinar series, this week discussing the future of retirement in America. With that in mind, let me pass it over to our panelists for introductions. Andrew.
Chad, thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the future of retirement in America, 6 forecasts for your financial future. As Chad mentioned, this is our annual BFSG summer webinar series. You're joining us for the 4th and final one. It kind of struck me at some point this week. I don't know if we have any Olympics fans out there, but I was watching that 4x100 relay, and that's the one where the swimmer jumps off, swims down, comes back, tags the wall. Next one's it. And I thought to myself, who is the poor sap that gets stunk with the anchor leg? And then I realized, of course, that's exactly the position I'm in. We've had a terrific first 3 webinars. You can see them listed on the screen there. If you want to check out any of the replays, please feel free to do so on our website, on Vimeo, or on YouTube. But I'm excited about the topic today. It's a tremendous topic. And I'm confident because we have secured a pretty incredible guest speaker, a former Hill colleague of mine, former senior policy advisor for Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and current vice president of the American Idea Foundation, Ted McCann. How in the heck are you? How are things in hot and muggy Washington, D.C. today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me here, Andrew. I really appreciate it. Things are moving along pretty quickly in D.C. We just had the infrastructure bill move forward. So I think we'll probably get into some of the stuff around how legislation moves, but it's an interesting time to be in D.C. at the moment.
Yeah, I heard that, and I heard, the August recess is in question, so everybody may not be getting their vacations like they hoped, but hopefully you guys will get a breather at some point. You've got so much experience on retirement issues. Can you just share a little bit about some of that professional background, just to kind of enlighten our listeners on your professional context?
Yeah, so I spent over a decade working on Capitol Hill. The key issues I worked on were pension, retirement, and Social Security issues. During my time, I worked on the Secure Act, and additionally, I worked on the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, which made some of the largest changes to Social Security since the 1983 reforms. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out ways that we could protect retirement security and improve retirement security.
Yeah. That's kind of what I expected from Ted, a modest introduction. Politics aside, whether you're Republican or Democrat, anybody in Washington, as a former Hill staffer myself, Paul Ryan is regarded as one of the sharpest legislators in the history of U.S. Congress, and nobody feared anyone more than Paul Ryan and his team. And Ted was a member of that brain trust. He rose quickly on the Hill. It's a competitive space. You've got to be sharp. Generally speaking, Ted, whether you realize it or not, you're considered one of the sharpest young minds up in DC. So we're lucky to have you. With that in mind, I'll tell you, we've got several hundred participants on the line today from all over the country. In fact, we may have a few clients who are abroad who are joining us today. Ted, I thought we'd start it off by trying to bring everyone together with a poll question on surprising retirement facts. So Chad, can I hand that back to you to facilitate?
Yes, sir. All right, everyone. So as usual, for any of you logged in on the computer, I'm going to launch polling right now. I will read the question, but I'm going to leave polling up for about 20 to 30 seconds. So the question is, which U.S. retirement facts surprise you the most? You can pick as many as you would like. Number 1, Social Security benefits to be cut by 21% in 2035. Number 2 is Part A of Medicare, hospital insurance insolvent by the year 2026. Number 3, between 1900 and 2020, life expectancy increased by 30 years. Number 4, government spending is expected to grow by 47% over the next 30 years, revenue by 7%. Federal debt set to increase to 202% of GDP by 2051. As of today, it's only 102% of GDP. In the last Congress, 151 of 344 bills were signed into law. About 44% were passed in the final 2 months. With that in mind, I know polls are still coming in. I'll leave it up for just about 10 more seconds and I'll close polling and we'll share results. And with most responses in, let me end polling. And I'll share results with the group. So the number 1 choice out there, 51% of people saying Social Security benefits to be cut by 21% in 2035 is the most surprising fact. Almost 50% also say that it's surprising that Part A of Medicare is likely to be insolvent by the year 2026, and then between 13 and 25% for the rest of the questions that we put out there. So with that, let me stop sharing results. I'll give it back to our panelists to discuss.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. That's interesting. I will say in our experience with clients, Social Security and Medicare are predominantly their retirement concerns, but it's interesting. It's kind of a mixed bag. One of the reasons I wanted to start with this question is not to be doom and gloom and the sky is falling, but I don't know if it struck you as you walked through that list, but any single one of those issues could significantly disrupt your retirement plan. If Congress is pushing through 151 bills in 60 days, who knows what's included in that? It may include your ability to withdraw from your retirement account at the age that you can do that. With federal debt and government spending, if that's not restrained, if that's unbridled, that can dampen long-term economic growth. That can affect your portfolio returns. If your longevity is more than you think, you may not have the means to provide for yourself later in your life when it can be very expensive. And then again, Social Security and Medicare, if that's not a fully funded benefit like you expect, that could be the difference between a vacation or a family trip or a travel plan in any given year. So, any one of these individually is a big deal, but taken together, something I say around the office a lot, probably ad nausea to some of my colleagues, but it's never been this complicated to be an American. It's never been this complicated to retire in America. What we know about retirement was handed down to us. It was passed on to us. It's this idea of the three-legged stool, right? So your company provides a pension, your government will provide Social Security benefits for you, and then your individual savings will carry you the rest. That was really given to us in the 30s. Just a quick history. It was provided by Roosevelt and his team, and I pulled out his message to Congress around that time because I think it kind of tells us what was going on in America in that era. And he said, security was attained in the earlier days through the interdependence of members of families upon each other and of the families within a small community upon each other. The complexities of great communities, however, and of organized industry is making it less real, those simple means of security. So we're compelled to employ the active interest of the nation as a whole through government in order to encourage a greater security for each individual. So take a step back for a second. Around this time in American history, we're moving from an agricultural economy to a modern industrial nation. What does that mean? That means that Americans are moving out of their communities, away from their extended families, and into the cities. They're not able to provide for themselves independently like they could in the past when you had grandfathers, aunts, uncles. It's just the model of America was changing. Now, that's not to say that components of the retirement stool weren't around in American history. For history buffs, Thomas Paine started kicking around retirement security proposals in 1795, Civil War pension programs in 62. By 1893, military pensions were dominating the U.S. budget. By 1900, we have 5 U.S. companies offering pensions. And then, of course, with the Great Depression, with devastating consequences, American retirees, their eyes are open to the importance of their individual savings. So this inflection point, 1934, is more significant from the standpoint of what our expectations are as Americans for our retirement. Now, all of a sudden, we expect that the government will play an important role in our economic security in our later years. Key milestones. We know Social Security enacted in 1935, Medicare, 1965, got ERISA in 1974. All of these programs, by the way, across the years, successive presidential administrations, Republican and Democratic alike, expanded on these programs, innovated on these programs. We got Roth IRAs in 1998. Let's call this like the blue zone, the blue era. This era is dominated by government inserting itself in our retirement. And then all of a sudden, 2021, here we are today. We've hit this longevity milestone. Think of this. If you're in your mid-50s today, 1 out of 3 males and 1 out of 2 females, you have a 90% chance of reaching age 90. I can tell you, when you review the history of the development of these programs, that assumption was not baked in. We didn't know we'd be living this long. So kind of our task today, Ted and I, is to consider this new red zone. Is there going to be a policy shift? So for so long in that blue zone, the policy creativity was about providing new benefits to American citizens. Now, today, that creativity may be applied towards trimming and rationing all of those benefits. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is, if you go into your retirement today, based on assumptions of the past few decades, based on assumptions maybe your parents told you, even on portfolio returns, there's no guarantee the recent past is a predictor of the future. We have to be much more careful and holistic in our planning for our retirement. This is a model that we share with a lot of clients. It's just a good way to convey, there are some things you can control in your retirement plan, and there are some things you have some control over, and there are some things that are out of your control. It would be easy just to kind of sleepwalk into your retirement, control your savings, control your spending. Your portfolio is going to deliver like it has in the past. You're set. But it's just too complicated these days. There are too many things that we have to account for, and all of them interact and affect each other. So, this is just a visual we use to reinforce the fact that you've really got to be diligent and intentional in planning for your retirement these days. And to do that, of course, at a certain point, you have to make assumptions, right? You have to have a thesis on what the future is going to look like so you can make decisions on all these retirement issues. Ted and I have got 47 minutes here to kind of predict that future for you. I want to walk you through the process of how we've kind of selected our issues that we're going to talk about today. Modern retirement in America, let's say there are 30 issues, 30 decision points you've got to make. Some of those issues and decisions are going to have a high financial impact on your plan. Some of them are not going to be as impactful on your plan, your financial life. Some of those issues have a high potential to change in the future. Some of them will not. Some of them, you pretty much know what's going to happen 30 years from now. Our job is to think through, of the things you have total control over, some control over, and things that are out of your control, what are the things that land in that high box? Because in all likelihood, your financial life will be sensitive to those issues. So if we throw in the issues you can control, portfolio management, that lands in something high impact, high potential to change. If we throw in issues that you have some control over, we see long-term care enters the picture. And then, of course, things are out of our control, which is often Washington is involved in that. We have Medicare, taxes, Social Security legislation. This is how we came to our 6 issues today, and we've summarized them in 6 questions for your financial forecast. Ted, I'm not sure if you've seen these. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit today. But here are the questions we've got. 1, will the legislative fix to Social Security be enough? 2, will you lose any Medicare benefits? 3, will you be able to afford long-term care? 4, are your taxes going to increase in the future? 5, can your portfolio withstand economic challenges? 6, will the speed of legislative change disrupt your plan? Ted, we're the anchor swimmers. Are you ready? Do you think we can dive in? Do you think we can tackle this agenda?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to do it. And I'm just glad that you called me young at the beginning of this,
No problem. Happy to do it. All right, let's go for this. Will the legislative fix to Social Security be enough? I'm going to try to go through this quickly because Ted's the real expert. I'm frankly interested to hear his thoughts on a lot of this. But one thing we all know, and you hear this a lot, is everybody kind of knows Social Security is at risk, at a high level. We know that the program, when it was established back then, the life expectancy was in the mid-60s, and now it's in the late 70s. So, the benefits when it started, just for retired workers, we have since expanded that to spouses, survivors, disability, family benefits. Those benefit offerings are growing. And then also the original logic of 16 workers to 1 beneficiary, that was pretty healthy. And now we're at a point that it's 3 to 1. So folks are living longer. We're having to provide more benefits, and we don't have as much revenue coming into the program. The obvious question, we all know this kind of intuitively. We plan when we're going to access our benefits based on this. Some folks like to do it early because they don't trust that the program's going to be there. Others want to wait because they can get that maximum benefit. The real question is, what happens if Social Security runs out of money? Can it run out of money? Is the program gone? Or do they just trim back benefits? And to answer that question, which we will in a second, we'll try to, is you've got to understand the logic of the program a little bit. And let's focus on that contributing worker per beneficiary. When this program was established, the logic was every existing anyone who's in the workforce today, we're going to take a portion of your paycheck, the payroll tax. That's going to fund the program. We're going to use that money to pay beneficiaries, folks who go on Social Security in that same year. Because there were so many workers relative to beneficiaries, we were acquiring a lot of wealth within this program. We weren't paying out as much as we were taking in. So we established these two trust funds, visualized two trust funds, big bank accounts up top. We start putting that money into that, and we invested in interest-bearing government securities. In theory, our thought was Social Security should be good to go. Those trust funds will always be there if we ever have any issues. If the economy takes a hit, we're not bringing in as much payroll taxes as we thought, we can tap into that trust fund. We'll be fine. Where we've come today is at a point that we're starting to dig into those trust funds. We didn't expect it, but we're having to do that because we're not taking in as much money as we're paying out. So when will the trust funds deplete? This is a visual provided by the Congressional Budget Office. This shows the picture for you. Try not to get too distracted. There are, like I told you, there are two trust funds. It can get a little technical to talk about how those are blended and how we tap into those. The black line is the one that really matters. And you see that in 2035, that trust fund is exhausted in theory. So we're going to pitch it to Ted in a second, but what will happen here is not that Social Security will crash in 2035. It's not that the program will go away, your benefits will go away. What we're talking about here is when that happens, when we no longer have a trust fund that we can rely on, we're going to have to rely on the incoming payroll taxes and a few other taxes to a smaller extent, but primarily that. So when you see your millennials walking down the street, even younger than us, Ted, you're banking that they're going to be earning and they're going to be paying taxes because that'll be your benefit. And the projection is that in 2035, you're only going to be getting 79% of your benefits. A few years later, that could go down to 73%. So that's what you need to keep in the back of your mind. That's the reality you could be facing unless Congress acts. And there are a lot of different ways they could do that. Let me quickly pop through these. Let's increase the payroll tax, right? So that's the tax that's coming off the paycheck. That's the revenue that's coming in every year. Or we could take the cap on payroll. We can increase that. Let's start for folks who make more money. Let's tax them above that first $142,000, or let's just eliminate that payroll tax entirely. Folks who are bringing in a lot of money, let's keep taxing them as it goes up. Or let's tax salary reduction plans instead of just payrolls and paychecks. Let's maybe FSAs or other programs like that. We're not doing that. Or we could just raise the retirement age. If we're all living longer, then in theory, our productive years should be extended. So we should be able to wait longer to receive our benefit. Or we increase the number of years to calculate those initial benefits. So in theory, that would spread out the amount of money you're receiving over time, and it's a smaller monthly benefit. Or let's index for longevity. We know that American longevity is increasing, so let's turn down the amount of benefits we're giving based on that. Or, we talked about right now, Social Security is investing those monies in interest-bearing government securities. Let's put it in the market. Is that gambling? That's an opinion statement, but let's get more out of that money than we're getting right now. But inevitably, I will say with many of our clients, the question becomes, are they going to reduce my benefits, particularly for high income earners? So Ted, in theory, if this is the board, if this is what we're looking at, what I'm kind of curious is where are we headed? How do committee staffers and legislators look at this board? How do they prioritize it? What do you think it's going to be?
Yeah, I think you sort of laid out a number of the options pretty well. I think one of the things to keep in mind when you're thinking about these options, you mentioned the trust fund, and sort of the trust fund economics really drive some of these options as better or worse. And that's in part because, as you mentioned, when the government puts money into the trust fund, they basically purchase bonds that pay a statutorily determined rate of interest. Because of that, tax increases in the short term actually have a stronger effect on the trust fund balances and have sort of a outsized improvement in the trust fund balances that you wouldn't necessarily see, at least in the short term, with benefit reductions. So I do think you're going to see tax increases be a significant part of the solution as policymakers look for ways to improve the solvency of the trust funds. I also think people are clearly looking at reducing benefits. I think they're trying to do it for high income earners. The thing you have to keep in mind with trying to reduce benefits for high income earners, the way Social Security sees people's earnings is they only see up to the first 142,800, as you mentioned. That's sort of the tax max right there. And so when they're trying to reduce benefits for individuals, you really can't go that far up the income ladder because, you know, you're automatically, even at the high end, you're reducing benefits for somebody making $125,000, $130,000, which is a significant amount of income in retirement, but it's not the billionaire that somebody thinks of when they think, oh, let's reduce benefits for rich people. So I think what will eventually happen is I think they're going to increase the payroll tax cap. I think they'll probably reduce benefits slightly on the high income side. And then there's an option that you don't have here. And it's in part because of the logic that you mentioned about how benefits and contributions have been linked since the beginning of this program. I think there's a really, really open question on if that linkage will be broken. So if you increase the payroll tax cap and you don't if you don't pay higher benefits associated with that, which a number of proposals do, you've broken the link between benefits and contributions. And if you're going to do that, you might as well look at just direct general revenue transfers. We'll talk about Medicare a little bit later, but Medicare there's two trust funds for Medicare. There's the Part A and the Part B. The Part A is funded through a dedicated payroll tax. The Part B has a partially general fund transfers. So on the positive side, from a retirement perspective, if you use general revenue transfers, then you're going to have to do less either on raising taxes or reducing benefits. On the negative side, it puts continued pressure on sort of the broader federal budget deficits and the broader federal budget as a whole. And so I do think the way the Congress will do this, I think they'll wait until, unfortunately, I worked for Congress for a long time, and the general tendency is to wait until the very last possible moment when there's a crisis that has to be fixed. And at that point, you take the most difficult choices that you have. And so you really do reduce the number of choices that you eventually have. But they'll eventually raise the payroll tax cap. They'll probably reduce benefits for higher income earners. And then I think they'll probably eventually break the link between payroll taxes, the contributions made to the program, and the benefits that you got out, and they'll shift to general revenue transfers. Because that'll be the easiest way to do it.
That's terrific. So I'm thinking in my mind, you know, when you talk about breaking the link, we'll get to Medicare in a second, but if we start shifting general revenue out of the Medicare program in Part B and Part D, I think is what, are we potentially going to have to increase premiums? Because part of those programs are supported by individual premiums. Would that have it in it?
Oh, so I guess what I'm saying is, I think similar to the Part B Medicare program, where it's supported in part by general revenues, I think Social Security will start to be supported by general revenues.
Gotcha.
And sort of the structure will shift where it will no longer be funded entirely by dedicated payroll taxes.
Okay. And then for, you know, you talk about in the short term, changing the tax logic here can have an outsized effect, and it could prevent kind of draconian benefit cuts down the road. If we kick this down the road more and more and more, if there's no burning platform, is it fair to say that the benefit reductions in the future could be more catastrophic to people? The longer we wait, the more it could hurt high income earners?
Yeah, I mean, the benefit of acting early is you can take smaller steps to make the overall program whole. You can have reduced benefit reductions overall, or you can have lower tax increases on everyone. Because every year you wait, an additional cohort enters onto Social Security. And unless the Congress is going to directly reduce benefits for individuals that are already on the program, which is highly doubtful in my mind, the changes may need to be concentrated on a smaller and smaller group of people. And so if we wait until 2035, as you mentioned, where there's going to be a 21% reduction in benefits, you know, according to current law, then if we wait, then we will, then we have to concentrate those benefit reductions or other changes on an individual there. So it's harder to do, and it will be more draconian if we wait.
Okay. And then another thing that popped to mind was when these ideas are getting kicked around and we start talking about high income earners, kind of how is that threshold conceived of? Is not specifically a number, but who is kind of making that decision on what is wealthy, high income?
Well, so I think that's the difficult part with Social Security, right? So the taxable maximum hits at 142,800. And so normally I think most proposals look at some percentile of income there, right? And so typically higher income earners for most proposals around the 60th percentile of earnings. But that's, you're probably looking at around $80,000 to $90,000 in retirement income, which is not that high earning, right? And so that's what I think makes a lot of the benefit reductions difficult because it is capped and because contributions are, or benefits are connected to contributions. The benefit reductions start hitting at at an income range that most people would not consider to be extraordinarily high income.
Okay. Excellent. So we've got 6 topics, and I'm looking at the clock, and I could talk for another 20 minutes on this, but at some point I'm going to have to keep this moving along. If you have any questions on Social Security, go ahead and send them into the chat box. But let's move on to Medicare. This is another, obviously, dominant topic for a lot of clients. Will you lose any Medicare benefits? Just as a quick overview, you have a 2-step process when you reach that age. The first step is you got to sign up for Original Medicare, and you're going to get your Part A and your Part B. It's for hospital stays and patient care, and then Part B is more for doctor's visits and outpatient care. Over the years, as we mentioned, this program has expanded, and it doesn't matter if it was a Republican administration or Democratic administration, it's grown. And so now you have other opportunities. You have Medigap supplemental plans that can help pay for out-of-pocket expenses not covered by Original Medicare. You've got Part C, which is kind of a private option to combine Part A and Part B. Part D is going to help you pay for prescription drugs. A lot of us know this at a high level. The theory, what a lot of us think in our mind is, I've paid so much into this program, I expect these benefits will be rich, and I expect that I'm not going to have to pay much out of pocket. And your retirement plan may base assumptions on that idea in your mind. But here's the challenge before us. So here's a theoretical retiree, a Medicare enrollee who has Original Medicare and has a Medigap plan. In 2021, for that Medigap plan, they're going to be paying about $122. Over the next 30 years, that's going to increase at an inflation rate of about 5.6%, some of the estimates. That is materially higher than normal inflation on other consumer goods. The healthcare space, this is just how the industry operates. Prices, expenses are skyrocketing. Same thing with out-of-pocket costs. That can be a number of different things. That can be for vision, dental, and hearing, which isn't always completely covered. It could be for Part A and B deductibles that's not covered by Medigap. Then you've got your brown category there, Part D premiums. That's going to cover your drugs, but you're also going to have some of your own out-of-pocket drug expenses. Not everything is going to be provided by Medicare. Those expenses are going to increase. You got your Part B premiums. Doctor's tests, outpatient visits, that's going to go up over time. But the real interesting kicker here is kind of that green box, which you don't see in the age 65 box, but you do see in the age 95 box. And that represents a lot of the program uncertainty here. So on both sides of the aisle, there are all sorts of reform policies that are being kicked around on Medicare. You have some that want to expand eligibility. They want to let folks in at age 60 or more, or open up the program to the greater public. You have folks who want to increase the benefits. They want to provide dental, hearing, and vision. They want to provide other resources that you don't have right now with the current program. And then, as Ted mentioned earlier, you have some real financial issues, particularly with Part A. Part B and Part D, they're supported by general revenues, as Ted mentioned. They're supported by premiums you pay. But Part A is not. It's very similar in logic to the Social Security program, where the payroll taxes are supporting much of this. And the recent forecasts are in 2026, I think we're looking at potentially 90% of payouts being available. So a similar dynamic with Part A, your hospital insurance that we saw in Social Security. So it begs the question, a lot of reform is needed. How do we do this? So let's just take a step back and look at the federal budget for a second. This is for 2021, a draft version, total spending $6.8 trillion. You start at the bottom, work your way up. We just talked about Medicare, Medicaid. We talked about all the reforms that are needed. The eligibility and expansion opportunities in the future could grow that number if we're going to do all these reforms. Same with Social Security. We talked about that a moment ago. More money is needed to support that program. But then you get into some other interesting categories, which are just as urgent as the other ones. Defense, obviously. What we're looking at here is operations and maintenance, military personnel, procurement of weapons. Historically, having a deep water Navy is costly, to say the least. We now have rivals around the world who have more battle force ready ships. So we have to fund defense to an extent. There are priorities there that cannot be ignored. Same with the non-discretionary space, education, transportation, veterans healthcare. There's a lot here that can't be neglected. There are promises that have been made to other constituencies outside of retirees that have to be honored. And there's this big old other category, which is going to vary year to year. And this year we've got the PPP program, Paycheck Protection Program, recovery rebates through the CARES Act, employment compensation. I could go on and on. The point here with this visual is just to say, with so many competing federal priorities, and it's only going to get worse every year, how in the world do legislators prioritize Medicare? How do we fit that? How do we move that to the top of the list? I'm just kind of curious, Ted, from your perspective, how does that prioritization occur? How are they going to prioritize Medicare?
I mean, the good news is Medicare, Social Security are always top priorities of the federal government and policymakers. As you know, seniors vote, and it's an incredibly important thing for most seniors. And so members listen. I remember in 2010, we were working on it was a pension smoothing bill, and we use it to pay for, basically, when you get to Medicare, there's an income based component in terms of your premiums. And again, for higher income earners, $85,000 roughly. If you're single, I think 185. If you're married, you pay a higher income related premium. And we basically stopped that from going up, even for sort of, again, higher income seniors. And so I think members and policymakers are highly, highly cognizant and highly aware of the importance of Medicare towards retirees. And it's something I think that they probably prioritize more than almost anything else. At the same time, as you mentioned, the growth in Medicare and Medicaid, our healthcare entitlements generally, is driving the budgetary pressures that we feel, and yet include defense in that. You have the $733 billion for defense. A huge portion of that is coming from healthcare with TRICARE and other things. So that when we talk about a budgetary problem, I mean, the budgetary problem fundamentally is how can we reduce healthcare costs overall? And so I think that's what policymakers are grappling with. We know we have a budgetary issue. We know it's largely driven by healthcare issues. So are there ways that we can reduce the rate of growth in healthcare spending? And to the extent that you can do that, then you can sort of maintain benefits for everyone. If you can't reduce the rate of growth in some way, shape, or form, then all of a sudden you're looking at either having to reduce benefits, having to increase taxes, and probably fundamentally we won't reach that point until the bond markets say, no, we don't think you can pay us back anymore. And that last item that you have, net interest, skyrockets, because that's probably very, very low at the moment because we're paying, I don't know what the current rates are on a 10-year treasury, but they have to be very, very low. I doubt there's not a whole lot of return in those at the moment. So
you're around 1.5%, plus or minus.
The investment professionals know this. So that number is going to go up. So I think that's the real question as we think about Medicare is, can we phase in some of these changes over time, and can we reduce the rate of growth? And can we do it before basically the bond markets say, no, we don't think you can fund this anymore? And it's sort of a guess, right? Nobody knows how long the bond markets are going to say that. I mean, Japan has a debt to GDP ratio over 200%. So it's possible, and we have a much larger economy. So it's possible we can continue going for a significant period of time. But I think there's a quote where you go broke slowly and then fast. And so I think the U.S., the concern would be eventually we go broke fast. And it would require difficult choices.
It's something that always struck me when we would review this issue on the Hill is when you have an older constituency that's so active politically, obviously, as you said, Medicare is top of the list for a lot of these legislators. Then you have an interesting dynamic of big industry, lobbyists, healthcare folks who that's a very entrenched industry, right? It's fee for service, volume driven. There are a lot of profits to be made there. And so I think I've seen some resistance in that area to some of the innovative reforms that could curtail the costs. Did you kind of see that in your seat in the speaker's office? I mean, do you guys feel that pressure at times from industry?
Yeah, I mean, there's two industries that are more active on Capitol Hill than any other. It's the financial services industry and the healthcare industry, in part because they're highly, highly regulated industries. And so, yeah, I think the healthcare sector is a huge part of how policymakers respond and form policy, in part for really, really good reasons, right? I mean, a healthcare hospital chain, it could be one of the largest employers in a member's district, right? If you're in, say, South Dakota, you're probably looking at, one of the larger healthcare or hospital chains employing 5,000 people in your district. And so that's going to matter because it matters for your constituents. And so I think members are going to be responsive to that, and they should be responsive to that. But it makes it more difficult because anything that's going to create efficiency in the sector is going to reduce costs somewhere. And that's going to eventually hurt someone. And so you have to think through, like, how do you want to constrain costs? So whether that means you shed employment because you become more efficient over time, whether that means you reduce costs in terms of providers, for insurers. And everybody's going to be sitting there trying to ensure that they're not going to be harmed by that. Yeah.
Excellent. Yep. Yeah, there's so much more we could dig into on that. And I'd love to. I'm going to keep us on moving here to the next topic. I want to do this one pretty quickly because on a time check, with our final three topics are top priorities with a lot of our clients. So with long-term care, at a high level, we all know that there are different models. There are different, we may have different interests. We might want a nursing home model. We might want to be more at home. Assisted living, we might want more of a social community. The point here is just to look at the expenses annually and think to yourself, will you need these? Can you afford these? And what style and what model do you prefer? And then you've got to weigh that against what are the probabilities in your lifetime that you'll need this care. So top graph there, needing assistance with 2 or more activities of daily living. Think like bathing, eating. The likelihood for males and females that you'll need any type of assistance is 64% is male, 75% is female. Now, how you get that assistance is going to vary. Family and friends, home care, nursing home, as we mentioned, and you can review those statistics. And then another piece of this is how long will you need it for? Annually, if you're paying $100,000 for nursing home care, are you going to need that for 8 years? Well, on the far right, 12% chance if you're a male and 17% chance if you're a female. So there's some mathematics here that you have to take into account when you're developing your retirement plan. And you can kind of flip through in your mind mentally, how are you going to do that right now? What is your current strategy to address this? Maybe it's to rely on family, but we've got to ask ourselves, how reliable is that support net if we need it? Our individual savings, if we're going to dip into that, what sacrifices are we making elsewhere in our budget to provide for this care? Insurance is out there and it's available, but it sure is a lot cheaper if you do it earlier in life. Life plan communities. Have you gone around and taken a look at what are the communities that are acceptable to your standard and which are not? Unfortunately, the industry, institutional care, has been ravaged with COVID. We've seen and heard just horrific stories of death rates, not only of the residents, of the staff. So do you even want to be in that kind of community in the future? And your home is always an asset, and that's part of the equation. But do you want that to be a part of your financial calculus for long-term care? If you've exhausted all those other options, government may not be there to provide the support or solution for you as they have with Social Security or Medicare. The Affordable Care Act addressed long-term care, but mostly for the Medicaid constituency. And there are some eligibility requirements around that you're going to have to look at to see if you fit. There are some public-private financing, creative policy reform ideas, but those are going to take a little time to develop and then matriculate. Home-based care as a model in general, this could be a more cost-effective way to manage long-term care for American retirees, but it's going to take time for us to retrofit homes. It's going to take time for us to shift the healthcare industry into a new economic model that makes sense for them to deliver care in a home environment. Now, the Biden administration, interestingly, did include, I think, $400 billion in an expansion of services for home-based care and some community-based care in their, I believe it was the infrastructure bill, just as a part of those negotiations. But last I checked, that was removed. That's been taken out. And then technology. Obviously, we know we're having rapid advancements in our abilities to deliver care in all sorts of settings, and we could rely on that, but it's a little dubious to rely on that. So my question here, Ted, is just more of a process question on the Hill. If long-term care, it's often forgotten by our clients in their retirement plan. And I don't know if it's forgotten in DC at the policy level, but it can feel that way at times. It's just not one of those squeaky wheels like Medicare that's going to get the attention. So when you think about Senate leadership or the administration's legislative teams, or in your case, the Speaker's office, with so many issues in general, how do they prioritize what gets on the agenda every year? How do they decide this is what we're going to focus on?
Yeah, I think the key thing you need to remember for especially congressional leadership, both House and Senate, is that the constituency of the Speaker, the constituency of the Majority Leader, the constituency of the whip are their members, right? They're elected positions. And so fundamentally, the priorities of what goes forward is going to be a reflection of the members of the broader conference. Now, those priorities are going to be sort of reflected through what's politically possible, what's politically popular. You're hearing from a wide variety of members in a way that, say, a committee chairman doesn't. One of the things that was very surprising to me when I moved from working for a committee to working for the Speaker is just I realized how many members were less than forthright with what they wanted when you were working for the committee, but they were very forthright when they were working for the Speaker, because you were negotiating large bills and you had the ability to sort of do things. And so they were very clear, this is what I want. And so the Speaker's job is to basically understand what the priorities of the conference are and then sort them into what is possible to get done. And you mentioned like long-term care, right? I mean, at one point, I don't think the federal government did forget about that per se. And I still think it's a big issue. I know we talked about it a lot when I was there. But if you recall, the Affordable Care did have a long-term care provision in it. And Senator Gregg at the time, he's retired now, but put in a amendment that required it to be actuarially sound. And there's just no way that HHS could create a long-term care program that was actuarially sound on premiums, right? It had to be paid for by the premiums. I think that's been the problem with long-term care broadly, is like nobody can figure out how to make the business model work. And even for people that would like to buy long-term care insurance, it seems to cost too much, and it's unclear what the benefit's going to look like in long term. So I guess that's sort of how we prioritize things in the Speaker's office. But it is one of those things where people seem to think that you have the ability to do whatever you want, and you are really, truly representing the conference more broadly.
So it's interesting when you're talking about the Senator Gregg option. So that was going to be like another program like Social Security or Medicare. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they wanted it to be fully funded by premiums. People could opt in, and functionally, basically, you had the way HHS analyzed the program was you would have a bunch of individuals in poor health that expected to need the long-term care insurance opting in, driving up premiums, whereas people that were healthier wouldn't opt in and wouldn't pay premiums in. So you wouldn't really have a very good mix from an insurance perspective, is my understanding of how they ended up analyzing it. And because of that amendment, and they couldn't make it actuarially sound, it eventually had to be dropped out of, they weren't able to go forward with it, even though it was in law.
So you think that idea is pretty much past us now? We've looked at it, it's off the table.
I think long-term care insurance, unless it's going to be something the way you mentioned, the President Biden put something forward where he basically said, we'll spend tens of billions of dollars, and it's not going to need to be self-sustaining. It's going to be difficult. And then you're going to run into issues around budgetary, the budgetary issues that we talked about earlier. And so it's going to be really hard to create a brand new entitlement program that's going to cost tens of billions of dollars a year when we also already face a number of budgetary pressures, and we want to shore up things like Medicare and Medicaid.
Excellent. All right, we have exceeded the intermission. I want to leave some time for questions. So we have a poll that I'd like to do just to kind of check the pulse of the audience. This one's on retirement risks. Chad, can I get your help?
Yes, sir. All right, everyone. So I've just launched polling right now. It should pop up on your screen for any of you on the computer again. Which retirement risk are you most concerned about? So this is multiple choice. You can select more than one if you would like to. I'll leave it up for about 20 seconds and then we will share results. And with most people having responded, again, I apologize for any of you that are getting to it at just the last minute. Let me close polling and I will share results with the group. So I could say about 50% say taxes, about 48% say rise in inflation, and then between 30 and 40% for politics, the economy, and federal spending and the national debt. Only 17% worried about rising interest rates. That's definitely interesting to see. With that, let me stop sharing results. I'll give it back to Andrew.
Very interesting, Chad. I agree. And we'll get into interest rates a little bit. Taxes. I mean, I got to tell you, that's always the dominant one, but it was a mixed bag. So that's interesting. Let's start with taxes. Are your taxes going to increase in the future? We all know the federal government is like a business. It's got to bring in revenue to pay for expenses. And my gosh, it feels like they hit us in every corner of our wallet. We've got the ordinary income tax. Even if you're really good with that and you're really creative in avoiding some of that tax, they'll hit you with the alternative minimum tax. We know our paychecks. A chunk of that's getting taken out from Medicare, same for Social Security. Even if you're self-employed, you're still going to have to pay those taxes. You've got anything you sell, capital asset. If you have a gain and you've held it over a year, you're going to have a long-term gain tax. If it's a short-term gain, you'll be taxed at ordinary rates. You've got dividends, the qualified, non-qualified that you got to contend with. If you're very successful with investing and you're at a certain income level, you're going to have a more of a Medicare tax coming out. You'll be taxed to death on your estate. You'll be taxed if you want to provide a gift to somebody else. And if that gift goes to somebody a generation below the next one, there are all sorts of rules around that. You've got customs duties on imports and exports if you own a business, corporate income tax. My point in all this is really at the end of the day, the government can tax you on whatever they want. They have the power and the authority, particularly with excise taxes, to go into any space they want. So you can think, are taxes just going to continue? Are they going to keep coming up with stuff? Am I paying more taxes than any American in history? And the results might surprise you when you look at this graph. These are federal receipts as a percent of GDP. What this is telling us, if you look after 1945, so after the Great Depression, after the Second World War, it's been relatively steady, the proportion of federal receipts to our growth. What this tells us is that the government has a pretty narrow band of revenue that they're working with, that they can play with when they want to fund programs, create new programs. That may make you think to yourself, okay, the current tax model, because there's been some sort of consistency to it, there is a correlation with GDP. Maybe I can rely on the past to be a predictor of the future. If you do that, though, you may be at risk, and here's why. Starting in 2006, when this graph starts, we start to see a shift in spending patterns in Washington. And honestly, it happened a little bit before that. But for the purpose of this visual, you see there the blue line. That's that narrow band of revenue that we were talking about. And above that, you have the red line of outlays. This is for everything in the world that policymakers can think to spend on. And you obviously see the peak in 2020, 21 with the pandemic. And then the projections going forward are devastating from a budgetary perspective. It won't work. Something has got to give. And so my question to you, Ted, is I can remember a time in Washington where it was almost fashionable to be disciplined fiscally. Even in 1998, we had a balanced budget. You can argue the math and how that was presented, but in theory, it was a pursuit that was of interest to the administration at the time. I think our last budget surplus was in 2001. I remember Tea Party movements. I remember Jeff Flake's conquest against earmarks and pet and pork projects. My question to you, though, is what we see now is it seems across both parties, there's a spending binge. It's an issue that hits all ideologies right now. So what is kind of the state politically of the movement for fiscal discipline? What's going on up there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, right? It's interesting. I spent the first, first half of my career working on trying to reduce budget deficits, working on those types of issues. The conservatives and the Republican Party has shifted a little bit in terms of how it views government. I think we see new members, younger members, folks that didn't sort of come of age politically in the 80s, and they're becoming more willing to use government as a tool to be helpful. So you have Senator Romney with the child allowance. You have Senator Hawley with a couple spending programs, and so it is definitely something new. I don't know where we're going to come back to getting discipline in the federal budget. I go back to I think what I said earlier is that the key constraint on what the federal government can do is going to be the bond markets and what the debt markets are willing to finance. And I think these charts will remain sort of where they are until the bond markets say we're no longer willing to finance growing and ever greater deficits, budget deficits. I think what we try to do was get sort of them in a place where the outlays were going down, and we're eventually going to meet revenues to tell the bond markets, look, we're going to eventually be able to grow our way out of the debt issue. But if you continue to have, the difference between outlays and revenues as a percent of GDP growing ever greater, eventually there's going to become a time when interest rates spike so high that we're going to have to make immediate changes. And I think that's probably the biggest concern from, if I'm looking at my own retirement, is what does that look like, and what are the policy changes necessary to do that, both on the tax side and on the spending side. So,
I won't put you on the spot, and so I'll just speak from my own experience, but there's a certain percentage of members of Congress who I'm not really sure they could articulate what the bond market is. So what I'm kind of curious of is if that is a key, if that's the precipitating consideration for us to act on this, who really is having this conversation up there about when it's too much, when the bond market, does that conversation even happen in back rooms?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Financial Services Committee and the Banking Committee understand that. They talk to folks a lot. I mean, Patrick McHenry's the ranker on the Republican side. And so I know that staff does really, really good work. I think the committee, when I was at budget, we spent a lot of time talking to folks at Wall Street. When I was in Ways and Means, we spent a lot of time talking to folks on Wall Street, same in the Speaker's office. I think they provide a really, really good viewpoint of what the markets will do or what they won't do in response to certain policy areas. Nobody's quite certain on anything, but they can at least provide their view. And so there's regular conversations on these types of questions.
So even in the current political environment, as polarized as it is, what I'm hearing from you is there are, not an opinion statement, there are responsible actors. There are folks, there's a steady current of folks who are looking at these issues seriously. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember, especially committee staff, the professional staff, they spend their entire day looking at like specific policy areas, and they're trying to understand how best to fulfill their policy goals and their boss's policy goals, within the constraints of what the world is actually looking like, right? I mean, people have ideological viewpoints, and they're going to press forward, and they're going to sort of filter information through that, but they are trying to get as much information as possible on how to move their bosses' priorities forward.
Okay. Do you see what is the likelihood that the solution to all this is just going to be higher taxes in an unprecedented spaces and wealth in other areas that we haven't seen?
So it's hard. It's really, really hard to know. So the chart you showed is a great one, right? It shows that revenues never get above 20% of GDP. Every time revenues have hit roughly 20% of GDP, you see sort of a political backlash to that, and you've seen reductions in taxes around that. So what does it look like in a world politically where you need to go above 20% of GDP, because in order to not do that, you need to look at changes to Social Security and Medicare, right? So you have two really strong political sort of issues that are facing, that you're running into, right? And it's hard to see how you can get enough revenue from, sort of the tax the rich sort of side, in the sense that there's just not that much money there at the end of the day. Like, the money is always going to be going down. Similar with Social Security, we're talking about, like, benefits are frankly going to low to middle income individuals. It's not necessarily going to the billionaire, and you can't really get a whole lot of money out of clawing back money going to billionaires or really high net worth individuals. The money in terms of revenues is going to be in that middle income sort of tax bracket, right? Middle to higher upper middle class tax bracket. You see that with some of the concerns around the state and local tax deduction, right? That you're seeing from Democrats now. And that's addressing people that are wealthy, right? I mean, they're making generally $500,000 to $1 million a year. That's really harmful to them, but we're not talking about somebody making $30,000 a year. And you already are seeing political pushback on that. And so I think the question is, when you're going to have two forms of pushback. One is going to be on revenues on middle-class individuals, and the other one is going to be on how can you support Social Security and Medicare without raising revenues on those individuals. And trying to balance that is going to be really, really difficult.
So it won't be enough just to simply go after the mega millionaires and billionaires. To really make a dent in this, you would have to climb down that ladder into that zone of the 400, 500, 600,000 area.
Yeah, you're gonna have to go lower than that. I mean, that's the other thing. President Biden says he's not going to tax anybody more than $400,000. Like, again, there's not that much income there at the end of the day. And so you're going to have to look at where the vast majority of income is. I mean, you can confiscate all of Jeff Bezos's wealth, and the budget deficit this year is trillions of dollars. It's not gonna make a difference long term. So,
excellent, great job. Let's keep it moving. We've got about 30 minutes at this point. We've hit the hour mark. For anyone who can stay on, I hope you will. The next two sections are very interesting, and then we've got some questions for Ted. I'll go through these quickly so we can have more time for questions, but obviously this question is an important one for everyone. Arguably, it's one of the most important issues you'll face in your retirement. Your portfolio value over time. When we have this conversation about portfolios, most of the time, if we're talking to a neighbor or brother-in-law, we're talking in terms of annual return, right? That's the language we use to describe if our portfolio is doing well. So if I presented you with two options, let's say you have $1 million in 1966, you put it in the market. You can invest it in a portfolio. It's called a blue portfolio, and your average return every year is going to be 8%. Or you can invest it in the red portfolio. Your average return will be 9.1%. However, the returns are going to be sporadic, right? And you can see that there. Early on, they might be a little less. You might have some negative years, but you'll finish off strong. Some of you, because we know compound interest, may think to yourself, well, gosh, we want the higher rate. It's the snowball effect. That's what we want. But the point I'm trying to make here is when you look at what the actual returns would be over the same time frame for these two portfolios, you'd be surprised at the impact. The higher returning portfolio on the average basis depletes before the end of your retirement. And what this is showing you here is something called sequence risk. So this is kind of the risk you will face in retirement that's associated with the order in which your investment returns occur. So in other words, if you're looking at retirement in the next 10 years, if you're looking at retirement next year, when you enter that zone of retirement is critical. And a lot of it's out of your control, obviously. If you start drawing down from your portfolio at a time when returns aren't as high, it could have a more detrimental impact over your returns in the long term versus a blue portfolio where everything's steady and consistent. We know life is not that steady and consistent. So this is important to us, knowing what's going on in the economy and knowing, am I entering at the right time? Here's kind of a high level overview of economic growth in the United States since the end of the Second World War. And what this is showing is just kind of a downward trend in growth. And there are a lot of reasons for this, and it gets a little theoretical. Not many societies in human history have advanced to the place we are. No one has a manual for how to keep the engine humming along. But one argument one could make is moving ahead into the future years, as economic growth is going down, we're also going to have new competitors technologically that we've never had before. If you think about American history, it has been a story of technological dominance, from steam engines to railroads, oil, kerosene, steel, electricity, internal combustion engines. Then we get into microchips and software. We have dominated. We have owned the global economy. We have sat on top. When we go into this next era, the future economy will be dominated in many respects by those who own the cloud, those who can manage artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, quantum computing, sensors, 5G. We've got people who are competing in that space in a way we've never seen in American history. So the point here is, if you're a policymaker in Washington, you see this chart, you see new competitors coming into this space. One solution to this could be more debt. If we have all of these social programs, all of these policies, these initiatives that we want to fund, one way to do that is pull out more debt every year. We had that visual earlier of the budget, and you saw there's a tiny sliver of green in net interest. When you start paying debt, or when you take on more debt, you're going to be paying more interest. That's going to cut into not only the government's budget, because we have to pay more in interest to service this debt. That's going to affect growth, right? Because some of the initiatives like transportation or education or healthcare, it could make the workforce less productive, not as much. That's one. But here's another concerning aspect of taking on more debt. You can crowd out private investment, right? So think about it. The government, when they're taking out debt, there's only a certain amount of loanable funds that are out there. When they're competing with that, private industry is going to demand more interest. It's just, it can have this catastrophic spiraling effect of muting investment corporate wide. And so the economy can just start to wither. So with debt, the thing to remember is it can just make the economy shrink. The more and more we take on, our growth can shrink and shrink and shrink. And again, this is theoretical, so nothing's prescriptive here. But what is interesting to me from the standpoint of Washington, if the economy depresses, obviously it's going to hit our portfolios. At a certain point, I'm curious, do folks in DC start to retreat and get defensive? Do we ever reach a point where the outlook, and like you said with the bond markets, where people are so concerned about America's ability to produce and generate returns that we all start to ration and protect what is ours? Do we retreat to camps? Does it become more tribal? And what I'm getting at here, Ted, is so many of these solutions in government are going to require a bipartisan approach. Is there a mood in Washington of, this is the end of the golden era, guys? Now the name of the game is protecting the interests of our own. What's kind of the temperature up there on this larger issue?
Yeah, so I've always pushed back a little bit on the idea that bipartisanship is over, that Democrats and Republicans don't work together. I think the headline that you see on a day-to-day basis are huge fights, whether it be around taxes, whether it be around sort of the most recent infrastructure bill, because that's sort of where the media ends up going. But I'd say on a day-to-day basis, there's actually a lot of different things happening. Now they're smaller and they're less meaningful in a way, right? I mean, large tax cuts, hit every single American, whereas like a career and tech ed reauthorization bill, hits a slice of America that needs help, but not everybody interacts with the career and tech ed space. We did a criminal justice bill that's really important for individuals that might have been justice involved, but doesn't hit most of America. So I think the Congress really does work on these small bore issues that affect niche constituencies regularly, and they work pretty well together on those issues. And so I'm still fairly hopeful that on some of these bigger issues, eventually we can get to yes. And I think you sort of see it with the current Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. There's also a bill, the Endless Frontier Act, that just passed.
Yep.
That addresses directly some of the technological threats that we are facing, and trying to ensure that the U.S. remains the sort of the leader in this space, as we always have been. I do think long term, right? Debt and deficit, that's a concern. It's always going to be a concern, I think, and something we're going to need to address eventually. But long term, I mean, we remain the most productive country on the earth, in large part because both our economic system and our political system, I think, is fairly robust. I understand that folks have concerns about that these days, but I think looking at China and the recent actions that they've taken around their tech sector, and sort of the impact that it's had on their stock market, we don't have those concerns in the United States. Like, there's no concern that President Biden's going to come in and sort of take Amazon over or whatever it is. We have a system that is robust and will work, and I think most policymakers and members of Congress think that, and I think they're going to continue working together on important issues going forward. So that's sort of my thought.
This is fascinating because for outsiders, we can feel the polarization. It can feel like we may even be devolving as a society. But what I'm hearing from you is there's a little bit more resilience to American institutions than we might think from an insider's perspective.
Oh, yeah. I think that people work together fairly well, and they get to yes on a lot of issues. The politically polarizing issues, people don't get to yes on because they don't want to. And there's clashes there, and they fight there. But where ideologically you can find agreement, or there's good trade-offs for both sides, where somebody's getting something, they're working together and they're trying to get to yes on those issues. And there's members and there's policymakers that are allowed that sort of aren't interested in working together at all on both sides of the aisle. But the vast majority of policymakers, the vast majority of people that get into this line of work, they're looking to try to improve the country and the world in some way. And so to the extent that they can do that, they want to do it.
I love it. Love the optimism, Ted. Love it. All right, let's keep this train moving. We've got one more issue, and then I bet we're going to get some questions on maybe even the topic we just discussed. So let's get to those questions. But the speed of legislative change, this is just something we all need to be mindful of. Congress, they can reach into your retirement in a number of different ways. Historically, they've done that in kind of three buckets: access, which kind of accounts are available to you, how you enroll in those accounts, how they escalate contributions, how they incentivize employers to provide matches. They also want to protect you. They want you to be aware of what you're signing on for. They've got robust disclosure and reporting requirements. Only fiduciaries should really be providing you any financial advice, and Congress is trying to encourage that as best they can. And then obviously there are restrictions on cash outs, loans, withdrawal types, and age requirements. And that's simply just a reality of Congress needing to protect, some of the programs that they put in place. But that's not really what's most important. What I want you to realize is there are so many things you need to be mindful of as you enter this age of your life. We track it daily, and I've got to tell you, these issues can move month to month. If I advance this slide, and you can review this on your own time, and just reach out to us if you have any questions about any of these. But if you look at the past 2 years, just reflect on the speed at which Congress has moved on some of these issues. So the Secure Act was a $1.4 trillion piece of legislation, and it touched your retirement, eliminating stretch IRAs, changing the age which you're required to take a minimum distribution from certain accounts. Then you've got the CARES Act, shortly thereafter, a $2 trillion bill. Now that touched some hardship retirement account withdrawal restrictions, the ages you could do that. It suspended that required minimum distribution, that RMD, for 2020. Move a few months ahead to the COVID relief package, $900 million, has stimulus payments you could have taken advantage of, housing assistance, other tax relief. And now we're getting into the real heart of the Biden agenda with the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion, more stimulus, more housing assistance, more tax relief. And coming down the pipe, we've got the American Jobs Act, the American Families Act. And those are in the process of getting negotiated. So there's a lot to be seen there, but that's, $3, $4, $5 trillion more, maybe less. Then you've got Secure Act, two that's coming down the pike. That's not on this because it's just in the process of being negotiated, but there are all sorts of implications there. It could increase your RMDs to 75. You wouldn't have to take anything until then. It could reduce the penalty for failure to take RMDs in general. It could affect your catch-up contributions, enable you to, at certain ages, put in more before retirement to fund your future retirement. So my point here is there are all sorts of different ways Congress can touch your life. It requires active monitoring. And I just want to get a sense from you, Ted, on kind of how fast is Washington? It can feel like these things just come out of nowhere. And all of a sudden we're having to call our tax advisors and our financial advisors and get our ducks in a row. Is there any way to kind of anticipate this? Like maybe you have a few examples. I think you were involved in Secure Act.
Yeah, so I mean, I would abstract from some of the COVID relief stuff. That did move really quickly in a way that's unprecedented, right? And I think that's because the nature of the crisis was unprecedented. But a Secure Act, right? I think part of it, what's useful is to think through about how these things come together, right? One of the negative changes in the Congress probably over the past 15 years or so is that procedurally things generally now move through larger budget bills. And the way that generally works is you have sort of a four corners negotiation. So you have the speaker, the minority leader, speaker and minority leader in the House, you have the majority leader and the minority leader in the Senate. And they're negotiating both the budget aspects of it and then a bunch of things that are sort of ancillary to that. And so you'll have just a wide variety of what's called authorizing language that the committees want to move forward. And as I mentioned, sort of the speaker and the leadership, the constituency is the broader membership. And so they're getting feedback from generally the committee chairs, like, I want to move this bill through and I want to get this bill attached to this piece of legislation because it's must pass. None of that legislation that they're trying to get attached is like new. It's been negotiated, it's been talked about. And there's either one of two things that are going to happen. Either A, on the Republican side, the Democrats didn't want it, but they're okay with it, but they're going to try to trade for something that they want. Or B, all four corners are okay with it. And so, what we would do is I'd go back to my committee chair, Nancy Pelosi's person would go back to their committee chair, McConnell and Schumer would go to their committee chairs. Are you guys okay with the inclusion of this? And anybody can sort of say no and knock it out, or say yes, but I want this in return, and see if that's a trade worth doing. And so these types of things happen over a long period of times and then very quickly, in the sense that Secure Act was a process that was probably 2 to 3 years in the making. I remember having conversations probably 2017 around the lifetime income disclosure portion of it with the mutual fund and life insurance industry, trying to get to yes on that and how you can figure some of these things out. And so these are just really long processes where people have veto points and you're trying over time to reduce the veto points. And then at a certain point, it's like, oh, okay, we have the ability to do it. We can do it, move it as quickly as possible so that nobody else comes with a new veto point that would disrupt the sort of apple cart. So I guess the speed, like there's always going to be, it's going to be very, very rare where something comes out of nowhere and hasn't been discussed a lot over time. But at the same time, these things do appear to come out of nowhere because they randomly get attached to budget bill X and then moves forward within 2 weeks. And you're like, wait, what happened? Like stretch is a good example like that. The stretch has been a provision, eliminating the stretch IRA has been a provision that's been around for a long time. It was envisioned as a pay for during Secure for a long time, but it's never really added because it's controversial. And then you're looking for a way to do it, and it just got added and people were okay with it and it moved forward very quickly. But it's not like the ideas were not around and not discussed. They were around, they were discussed, they were sort of talked about by a wide variety of individuals. So.
Oh, no. All right. Well, all right. I just got an alert that said Ted is doing a heck of a job. Can he take questions? Andrew, keep your mouth shut. Let's put Ted on the spot a little bit. So Ted, are you open to that? Can we field a couple questions for you? All right. Yeah. Chad, I'm going to hand this over to you. We're going to skip our final poll. We're going to land on this slide. And have we gotten any questions that are of interest?
We have. So actually, I think my initial comment that I was going to strictly screen them, kept a lot of questions at bay. So we actually only have 2 of them. One is regarding math. One is regarding Social Security that came in relatively early. For all of you on the line, though, before I do get into questions, if you do need to drop, I did paste a bunch of links into the chat box. We got a link to our normal 1-2 minute survey, a link to the slide deck if you would like to download it for future reference. And then one of the questions was on sequence risk, so we will address that question, but I did paste a link to, I think it's like a 6-minute video we did a couple of years ago on YouTube that will also help explain how sequence risk works after we explain that question in just a couple moments. So with that, the first question, gentlemen, back to Social Security is, how does the wave of baby boomers play into Social Security, thinking both short-term and long-term, right? Because they're still going to be retiring for the next 10, 15 years. And then, what are the ramifications, into the year 2075 and all those kind of things?
Yeah, so first baby boomer, I think, started retiring in 2010. So fundamentally what the baby boom generation does to Social Security's finances is sort of accelerate the financial straits that we probably otherwise would have eventually gotten anyway, right? So you have an aging population. Andrew talked a little bit about longevity issues. I think when Social Security started, longevity to age 62 is like plus 11 years. Or age 65 was at plus 11 years for men and plus 13 or 14 for women. Now it's probably plus 18 for men and plus 21 for women. And so you would have seen financial difficulties with Social Security coming. But what this wave of boomers does is basically accelerate that. Because if you look at Social Security's finances, there is like a small hump, and it goes up, it comes down, but then it starts to rise again. And so what that hump does is accelerate some of the financial concerns with the program that you otherwise probably would have seen anyway.
Got it. So the next question, Andrew, if you can go to the sequence risk slide, just asking, can we spend a little bit of time explaining kind of the math and reasoning behind your forecast number 5, specifically the volatility versus non-volatility? Yeah, exactly. And so this one, I mean, for anybody that wants a little bit more in-depth conversation, it is a 6-minute video in the chat box on YouTube that you could all watch and kind of understand sequence risk a little bit more. But Andrew, can you kind of explain that top slide a little bit?
Yeah, so the top slide here, again, it's kind of, imagine the scenario. Imagine you're back in 1965, 1966, and you've got $1 million that you can invest in the markets. You can do that in one of two ways. You can do that the blue way, find a fund that's going to deliver annually, like clockwork, 8% return. Now, of course, we know in reality that's impossible. We can't predict the markets, but theoretically for this exercise, that's what you do with the blue portfolio. The other is, the proposition to you is, we'll give you a return that's 9.1% over the life of that portfolio through 1995. But you're going to have returns that are going up and down. So the key to this, the reason why the red portfolio does not perform as well as the blue, is if you look in these earlier years, and I'll help try to signal that out for us. Negative return right out the gate. Modest return, negative, low return. Now compare that to the later years where it's high, it's strong, it's robust. What that does is it just decimates the potential for growth early on. It reduces your ability to catch back up to what that blue portfolio is doing. This is a topic that is pretty abstract. It's hard to explain, and I think that's why that video that Chad is referencing is so valuable. But Ted, anything you would add on sequence risk? Is that something that's kind of discussed in Washington as a phenomenon?
No, people don't really talk much about sequence return risk. I think, the thing that I always think about when I think about this from my own personal perspective is I read a guy named William Bernstein a decent amount. He's got a series of books on deep risk, at least from a federal perspective. And, I think the concern would be, are there political risks that you're facing that would sort of contribute to this sequence of return risk? And I think we're kind of seeing that with some of what's happening in China right now around their regulatory actions. I don't see it happening in the United States, but that'd be the only thing I would think about.
Yeah, so I think I could add a little bit to that. So if you were to reverse the returns on that top chart, and this is what that short video does, you'd actually see the exact opposite, right? The red line would outperform because early years, you're pulling less money out than you're earning in that portfolio. So the idea is that if you need to take 8% out of your portfolio every year to fund your retirement, and the portfolio is generating less than that, you're depleting principal. right? So on the left-hand side, depleting principal, and those negative withdrawals and depleting principal is really hard to ever earn back towards the right-hand side of the graph. But on the flip side, if you had really good market years at the very beginning of your retirement, you'd see the exact opposite, right? And then you'd be at the end of your career or end of your retirement needing less money, and your assets might have ballooned to enough that it could sustain an 8% withdrawal every single year. Yeah, I think the problem is a lot of retirees have a hard time when their portfolio is down, spending less in retirement, and when their portfolio is up, spending more. You typically just need about the same amount of money every single year, and that can be really detrimental to a portfolio in years the markets are down overall. And so that we did get another question, gentlemen, and so I think this is really for both of you. What is the likelihood of means testing? We know it's being discussed. I think anytime we have, Keith loves to talk about in our other webinars that it's a prospect that all of our clients should at least be paying attention to. And if they're in retirement years, maybe delaying Social Security. If they see means testing it's going to happen, they should just start taking Social Security right away to avoid it. Do you guys have any idea of the probability that this becomes a thing for Medicare or Social Security?
Yeah, so Medicare is already means tested, right, through the IRMA, through the income. I forget the exact, it's called IRMA, and I can't remember the exact acronym name now, but it's already slightly means tested. I could see that expanding a little bit. I do think with Social Security, eventually there will be a reduction for higher income earners in their benefit amount, which is going to be means testing in some way, shape, or form. So I think that's probably pretty likely. I do think that any changes that are made will exempt people that are of Social Security age. So if you're thinking, oh, I need to claim at 62 to avoid getting hit by the means test, I think probably they'll say if you're eligible for Social Security, we're not going to make changes to your benefit. And so, I think they'll probably exempt anybody, under the age of 55 or over the age of 55 or 60 or whatever numbers that they need to make it work. But I can't imagine they would say, oh, if you're 62 and you're claiming already, you're going to be exempt from this means test, but you're 62 and you're not claiming, you won't be exempt from this means test.
Yep. Got it. Yeah, great answer. Anything to add, Andrew?
No, I think that's perfect. I think we get that question a lot from clients. Everybody senses that some change is going to be made, but to what extent can they kind of be grandfathered in? Do they need to pull any levers to activate to protect themselves? And again, I would just encourage you with all these issues. I tell this to my family, I tell this to my friends, and I tell it to clients too. Try to find somebody you trust. Try to find somebody that has knowledge and experience in the space and can monitor and track these things. We do it here on a daily basis. And anytime you have these questions, just reach out to us and let us know. We can help you navigate that. But no, I think Ted's analysis is spot on as always.
So I got one more question just came in, and I love this question actually. I think it goes back to your little flower chart on out of control, some control, and in control. Do you guys have any tips on how some of the audience and attendees may be able to prepare for some of those things that are just completely out of their control?
I mean, I think, and I guess this is probably more of a question for Andrew, but I think the two things that you can totally control are your savings and spending rate. I mean, so you can always save more, and you can reduce expenses. So I don't know, Andrew, I thought you'd respond.
It's a hard question. The way I kind of explain it, particularly to family, friends, and clients, again, is nothing's predictable, right? In America we're facing things we've never faced before, but we are a society that we've created ourselves, and there's a natural logic, a natural rhythm. To some extent, some of this can be predicted. And why we brought Ted on today is if you have that kind of access, you can monitor things and you can start to get some heads up. And so for those issues that are out of control, the unknowable and the complex, you can start to reduce to levels of probability that are manageable. And once we can get into that zone, what we do is we then correlate those probabilities across your financial plan, across all the issues and things you have to manage, because we won't go into it now, but not one of these issues is not affected by the other. You can't make a decision about one without considering longevity on the other, or likely tax effects on capital gains here, or if you tap into Social Security, all of this is tied together. So the best answer I can give in a short time period is reducing the unknowable to likely probabilities, and then having that be your thesis on the future and developing your plan around that thesis. That's a process we do on a daily basis with our clients.
Yeah, I mean, I could say, one more thing to add to that is that saving and spending is completely in your control. Like nobody ever gets to retirement and says, oops, I have too much money, right? That would be the best problem for all of us to have. And if you have too much money, then really it doesn't matter what the market returns and what happens to the economy. If you have enough money to sustain it all, right? So just save as much as you can and hopefully you get there. Next question we got that just came in is probably shy away from actual statistics and like probabilities, but how much of a conversation is there right now about a potential wealth tax? And is that seem to be picking up steam or reducing a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, there is definitely talk about it especially on the hard left. Elizabeth Warren's talked about it a lot. I think any tax professional, and no matter what you think, I mean, the Ways and Means staff and Senate Finance staff are tax professionals, and they're really, really knowledgeable about like how, not just like how much revenue they're raising, but like how do you implement something like this? And I think most of what the tax professionals see is that countries have tried to implement a wealth tax before, and it's nearly impossible, right? Because there's so many different ways you can try to game that system, right? All of a sudden, there's a ton of money going into fine art, and like, how do you tax fine art? And so it's just a really, really difficult policy question to figure out. And I don't think there's really been a good answer to a lot of the questions from just the implementation stage. And so now I sort of mentioned earlier that there's a lot of veto points, and there's a lot of work done before anything ever becomes law, and it goes through a lot of different checks among different people. It seems like the policy community in the tax space has raised a lot of concerns about what a wealth tax would look like that have not yet been answered by some of the proponents. And so until that happens, I wouldn't be really all that concerned. Now, it is very popular, I think, politically. And so because of that, you should always at least be keeping your eye on it. But until they answer some of the more technical questions, I think it's gonna be really hard for them to gain a legitimate amount of traction to move it forward.
Ted, when you talk about those policy circles that may be somewhat resistant to the concept, or is that on both sides of the aisle?
Yeah. I mean, if you talk to Democratic tax experts, a lot of times they're like, I have no idea. How the IRS is going to have to try to figure out, like, how do you value private companies, right? Like, I mean, was the private equity industry going to, I mean, how are they going to value all this stuff? Like are they going to lowball it? Then it's so difficult. They'd have to create an entirely new, probably group like that would evaluate complex assets in a way that would have to be way larger than what they have now, extraordinarily intrusive. So it's a really, really hard question to figure out.
So the headlines that we see, and that can cause concern for a lot of us, you see that as much political posturing as a realistic policy conversation. You're not too worried.
Because the easy way to do it is just to tax, a wealth tax of 1% on, I think Elizabeth Warren has one for above $50 million. She has some stuff around, like how do you do non-public assets? But if you have, it's easy to do public assets. But if you do public assets, then the public asset, public equity market would cease to exist, right? Because people would move their money into private assets. And then you got to figure out, okay, well, how do you value these things? How do you value a piece of fine art?
So maybe tying together some comments you made earlier, when things start to get shaky in the bond market, would that maybe be one time where we would see this? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do see with the COVID, the crisis around COVID, how quickly Congress can move and how they can move with policy issues that might not have been fully baked, and they might not have. The unemployment insurance is a good one. I remember talking to friends who are like, we'd prefer to do it different ways, but like the state unemployment computer systems just functionally could not do it any differently than the way they did the bonus amounts. And so you do end up in a spot where there's nothing but really, really bad options. And so policymakers are trying to decide between bad options. And all of a sudden, something that might have been unthinkable before becomes better than defaulting on debt.
Okay, gentlemen. So I know we're at the 90-minute mark. So I get one more question. It will be the last question, even if another one comes in, to be respectful of Ted's time. But it is a fun one coming in from the chat box. I knew we were going to get it at some point. So I don't know if it's going back to defense spending or what that might look like, or interest rates. But Can you speak, and I'm Ted, be ultra high level to this. This could be politically sensitive. Speak to the troubles we seem to be hearing about with China. What they're facing with our military, any potential collateral development. Is there anything that you see going on there that you are even able to speak to today?
I would never did national security or foreign policy, so I can speak to it because, like most people in DC, I love to hear this on my own voice. But I don't know if I have any actual insight into that issue. The only thing I'd say from like a retirement perspective, because again, I do love to hear the sound of my own voice, so I'll say something, is back to like the idea of deep risk. Like we have lived for the past, since World War II, in a world without like meaningful conflict in any way, shape, or form, in a large part because it's been a unipolar world where we've sort of generally set the rules of engagement. And so I think there is probably a shift in the way we should think about geopolitical risk as that shifts a little bit. What that means, I have no idea, but it probably means something.
Awesome. Ted and Andrew, guys, thank you so much for your time today in presenting and joining us. Ted, especially taking 90 minutes out of your day to come and join us and present to our clients. Thank you to all the audience for being on the line today. Again, Andrew's information is at the top of the page. If you do have follow-up questions that you would like to hear, definitely reach out, financialplanning@bfsg.com, and we will try to address those for you. All of this content is posted on our social media, Vimeo, YouTube. If you want to follow us, make sure you always get the newest webcasts and content as it's delivered. With that, thank you everyone for your time today, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.